about his recently, not even that recently now that I look at it, somewhat recently posted paper on magic state injection. Okay, so take it away, Nick.
Yeah, so this, let me get full screen up. Yeah, so this is not as recent work. This was up mid-January, I think. And for many of you, you've probably heard bits and pieces of this over the course of my PhD. But obviously there's a lot of honor students here, so I'm just going to present this, assuming you know nothing about this work. The essential goal of this work was to really understand what does noise look like in the context of various like fault-tolerant gadgets. And in particular, we were interested in looking at magic state injection as a sort of more involved, complicated gadget. How does noise get manipulated there? Supervisors, Robin Harper and Stephen, obviously this was done under Equus. I guess Equus is technically under here. You know where the UCID is, so not much more need be said. But yeah, as a broad sort of set of motivations, sort of characteristics of logical noise are fairly unexplored. You know, we've started to think about looking at how characteristics of noise matter, sort of like at a physical noise level, right? If you have some kind of underlying device bias or noise like that, you know, you only have to look at like the XZZX paper to really see that paying attention to these kind of things can have a really important impact on the performance of fault tolerance. And various things like that would then influence how you would want to actually sort of design your architecture. And, you know, it's become very big to sort of actually like experiments that are actually looking at this. Very recent, obviously there's a result that came out that we saw at QEC from Harvard, right? And, you know, this is very relevant at the moment. And so I guess if you would ignore the rest of my talk, right, I would say these are like the kind of three big takeaways in terms of like what actually were the big sort of factors here, which is that through the course of doing fault tolerance, like sort of error correction and stuff like that, noise is going to transform, like in terms of character, but also the actual process of doing things like error correction amplifies the amount of bias that you have from the physical level to the logical level. But various things like how you do error correction is going to have a big, as in sort of the noise within error correction, knowing that error correction itself is a faulty component, very much influences what kind of logical bias you're going to have at the end. But to actually maybe go through, give an overview of the details, right? What we're actually doing here, right? So this is a lot of numerical simulations of fault-tolerant magic state injection in the Steam code, looking at a variety of noise models, trying to use it to sort of diagnose the kind of main effects that you see at the logical level in the noise. Yeah, and so as essentially structure the talk, sort of outline sort of the noise that actually, like what is the noise that we're looking at? Like how does it work? Like sort of what are the fine details? And then see what we get at the end in terms of logical noise. Any questions, burning questions before we go through things? Okay. Cool. So what actually is the T-gate for those who may be less familiar? It's essentially this non-Clifford gate, just like depends on definition, but sometimes you get called pion 8 gate. It's like a pion 4 rotation on the block sphere for a single qubit gate. And the reason why you might care about something like this is that using just Clifford gates, you can't get universal quantum computation. In fact, if you just have like stabilizer states and Clifford gates, this is actually classically similar in polynomial time by Grossman-Keneal. So you need some other kind of something outside of this set in order to do universal quantum computation, and the T-gate is a very common way to think about this, or associated with the T-gate is you have these like magic states that can help you do sort of things outside of this. And you can see these are very closely related. You know, you can take some X eigenstate, apply a T-gate, you would get this magic state. And one very prominent way that people see that you would do universal like quantum computation is that you would use magic states to implement T-gates. And then with your T-gates and with your Clifford gates, you now have a complete set to do any arbitrary unitary that you would like. Why would you do something like this? It seems like you've kind of pushed back there's like a T-gate that you need to do to like prepare this state. And then you're making a T-gate at the end. Kind of feels like you're kind of just like pushing the problem into like another corner. But the big thing here is that, first of all, everything in this circuit is Clifford, right? And this magic state is a separate state you can prepare such that using things like magic state distillation, you can actually prepare offline this magic state to a very high fidelity, and then using only sort of fault-tolerant Clifford gates, you can then get your T-gate fault-tolerantly. And so that's the context for why magic state injection is so key to a lot of schemes, or some form of taking this magic state into a T-gate. And just to do a bit of the laundry, sort of looking at CPTP operators, fidelity is defined in a fairly standard way. But I think probably the most important thing to comment on this slide is the fact that when I'm talking about logical noise, I'm talking about process noise that would be undetectable, like that acts on the logical subspace non-trivially.
You mean undetectable if you measure the stabilizers of the code?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and so let's get into the noise, right? So the actual simulations we did involved Pauli noise models. There's some subtlety in the simulations because obviously not all of the gates involved are actually Clifford, so there's further details here. But as far as Pauli noise is concerned, right, it's fairly well motivated because you can always do things like Pauli twirling to turn arbitrary noise into sort of stochastic Pauli noise. At least this is something that is well attested to as being performing well. But even if you have something like a Pauli noise channel, right, even then there's like 4 to the n-1 parameters for an n-Clifford space. So this is still a very large set of potential noisy operators that you might have, right? And so even just thinking about this in terms of the parameter space and exploring this parameter space, you might want to bring this down to something that's more palatable. And bias is a very natural way of doing this, right? Essentially sort of divide your set of Pauli errors into sort of a high rate set and a low rate set, and then define a bias as the ratio between those two. And so just to give some examples, you could define single qubit bias, and this is more common, sort of the ratio of Z errors to X and Y, but also you might be interested in sort of multi-qubit bias as well. And here's an example with 2-qubit Z bias. And this is particularly important because especially in sort of entangling gates, you expect that you have some kind of correlated noise across the gates that you're acting on, because obviously it has a correlated action as well. And so really thinking about multi-qubit bias is essentially core to the things that we simulate here. And so what form do these noise models take? Essentially, what is this equation, right? This is just the Pauli noise model where the bias is this eta parameter. The probability of error is P, or the probability of no error is 1 minus P. And all high rate errors have the same probability, all low rate errors have the same probability. That's the real takeaway.
Okay, so there's a set. So Q, calligraphic Q labels a set of high rate Pauli errors.
Yes.
Essentially not just one, but we're just literally dividing the Paulis into two, like one that's more likely, one that's less likely.
Yeah.
And then those sets have some number in them. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then that gives you a 2-parameter noise model.
Yes, exactly. Technically, because if you're exploring this space, you have to choose a Q, and then that kind of is where the space gets divided up, because we're going to be looking at different kinds of bias. So really, there's more parameters than that, depending on how you think of it. But yeah, given you have some bias of interest, it's 2-parameter. And in our case, what we're going to be looking at is, so we're going to be looking at especially sort of 2-qubit bias across CNOTs, right? Sort of entangling gates. For a lot of architectures, entangling gates are kind of the predominant noise. And for various reasons, sort of the effects that you see there are broadly indicative of kind of the predominant sort of sources of noise that you'll see at the logical level. Not entirely, but sort of what you'll see throughout these results is that these sources of other noise are kind of related to the same sources as these sources. These kind of subsume the greater category for the most part. So this will be 2-qubit bias.
So when you say 2-qubit bias, you mean weight 2 Pauli errors are higher probability than weight 1?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
And so here's an example of 2-qubit Z bias, right? And so the probability of Z1, Z2 would be equal to the probability of Z1 or Z2.
Then like depending on the gate, you apply different noise channel basically. Is that the idea?
Yeah, so there would be some defined bias and some defined error rate for each gate. And then you would have so-and-so noise model associated with that.
So identity gates also get noise or no?
Well,
Identity gate is 1 minus P.
Nick, in the previous slide, so
Mhm.
like when you say you partition a set of Pauli errors Pn, is like n just 2 there for a 2-qubit gate?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, exactly. I'm being very broad here in this, but generically, you just define some set that divides up the n qubit. And I guess this is probably worth stressing a little bit, dividing up the error set, right? So the probability of the identity does not contribute to the actual bias.
Yeah.
And so this can go from infinity at like sort of everything is in the high bias set to 0 where nothing is in the high bias set.
Yeah.
But
So here by 2-qubit, I mean, by 2-qubit errors, you just mean errors that can act on pairs of qubits.
yes.
And then here you're picking out the Z ones. Because the normal error model that's not, if I have a 2-qubit gate in my circuit, the phenomenological error model would give all Pauli errors with equal probability. So specifically then the probability of 2-qubit errors is higher than the probability of 1-qubit errors in that noise model, right?
Yes, because there's 9.
There are
opposed
more
to-
because there
yeah.
are 9 as opposed to 3. But here, yeah, okay. Here you're saying like, let's pick, you know, we're doing a CZ gate or something. Z errors are special. All the Z errors have equal probability.
Yes, exactly. I guess any further questions before we go on? Cool. So main thing to keep in mind here is that this is embedded in the Steam code. I think Steam code should be fairly familiar to everyone here, but if not, like the main thing is that it has a transversal Clifford group. So Hadamard, phase gate, S phase gate, and C naughts are all transversal. So you only need the T gate to make this universal. But it's a very small code, right? It's the smallest color code and it's distance 3. So that means you can correct any weight 1 Pauli error. And I will stress that fact actually a little bit before we go on. There's been a lot of work to sort of build like really good stabilizer measurement schemes for like the Steam code in particular. A lot of work's gone into things like dealing with hook errors and stuff like that.
Hook error?
Where like single qubit errors on like the ancillas that are measuring the that are measuring the stabilizer syndrome can spread to higher weight errors, which are potentially uncorrectable. So in this case, we have a single Z error in the middle, like occurring on this ancilla qubit, and then it has no impact on the ancilla syndrome, so you don't even detect this error, but it spreads to a weight 2 error on the register, and then will be corrected into a logical error later on.
Yeah, okay. I just observed that. I mean, I've sort of, it was a little bit of a joke saying what's a hook error, just in that maybe not everyone knows, but also they didn't, although that kind of error was the main object of study in fault tolerant circuits from the mid-90s, they didn't seem to attract the name hook error until much more recently. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. It's like a circuit level error. You know, we assume that stabilizer measurements are faulty, and so we should worry about these.
So it used to be that one would say that a circuit was fault tolerant if correctable errors anywhere in the circuit didn't propagate to uncorrectable errors on the code block at the end of and so this would just be an example of not fault tolerant.
Yeah.
But yeah, these days you call it a hook error. I think a hook error is specifically where the single error is on the ancilla.
Yes.
So it's a specific example of failure to be fault tolerant.
Yeah.
Why do they call it a hook error? What's the hook?
Search me. I mean, that's why I think it's like.
If you put on the surface code, it looks like a little, like where the errors are, it looks like that.
Even here you can see it, like if the next figure and the left figure when Z happens, and the effect of that Z would be that it will travel to qubit 6, and eventually to qubit 7, and that also forms like a hook shape.
It's only really called hook error in the context, I feel, like topological code. If people are like talking about fault tolerant concatenation scheme, I don't think they call them.
I think this battle is lost, Larry. I think they're calling them all hook errors. And I honestly think that inventing this name was a bit silly in the first place. Okay, but they're hook errors.
I
I'm
guess
pretty sure people like, yeah, I'm sure I've seen outside the context of fault tolerant them referred to it. I think it's just proliferating the usage of this term. I think could be wrong.
I'll also add that these figures here are from Reichart's paper. I haven't referenced this, but I just want to make that clear as well.
So did Reichardt call them a hook error?
Yes.
Yeah. See.
But these are topological codes, though.
Oh, come on. This is another fiction. It's this. Come on. Okay.
But yeah, you would get these kind of new ways of measuring syndromes on the right here, right, with some extra ancillas, which have extra entangling gates in a good way, such that these errors don't like spread, or they can be caught in some way and dealt with. But you don't have to actually add new ancillas.
So where does the error occur on the right figure?
Well, any error will get caught, right? That's the key thing. Or at most it spreads to 1 qubit, but that's at the same weight as what it was introduced as. But actually, if you start thinking about sort of multi-qubit errors, this starts to break down a bit, because like if you're adding new sort of entangling gates between multiple qubits. So you should really look at multi-qubit errors actually now. And so you get like multi-qubit hook errors, which people have not really dealt with. And so like this, say there's some ZX error like this, right? This is undetected, but it spreads to a 2-qubit error. And now I've heard often
Yeah,
that,
although to be clear, so in the original fault tolerance literature, they would call that thing a single fault, because that's a 2-qubit error that's associated with the 2-qubit gate that sits before it. So it's an individual fault. And if you were going to be fault tolerant, you would want that to propagate to only a single error on the code block.
yes. And then I've equally as well heard, but this is an XZ error, and the Steen code can correct a single X error and a single Z error. And I don't
true.
think this is actually a good thing to say, because an XZ error passes through a transversal S gate to become a Y and Z error, which now is apparently 1 X error and 2 Z errors, which is definitely not correctable. And so unless we say that this transversal gate is not actually fault tolerant in some way, because it's taking sort of a correctable error to an uncorrectable error, right? I think we should rather say that this error is just not correctable to begin with.
Although you would run, can't remember how you would do an accounting. You would run a round of error correction immediately after that first gate. I mean, if I want to be, I would run error correction every time I do a gate. So there would be a step of error correction between.
But this is the step of error correction,
Uh,
and there's no
oh yeah,
flags,
no, you're
right?
right. Okay, yeah, no. Okay, so that's definitely not fault. Yeah. It's
Right,
definitely
and
not
there's
fault-tolerant,
no,
yeah.
so there's no indication on this
Yeah.
thing at the end
Yeah,
that it's
that
got
anything went
flags.
wrong, and then you go and you do the following gate, and it's bad. So yeah, no, there's definitely not fault tolerant. You're totally right. Yeah.
And so that's also why I stress, this distance 3 code, it really can only correct one. It's like these 2 qubit errors, they're not special. You should really worry about these 2.
So isn't there, so this is this flag-based scheme for catching signal, but isn't there a generalization where you then have syndrome measurement circuits which can handle 2 errors? Basically, they have this property where 2 errors remain, like weight 2 errors remain weight 2 errors.
Well, this is still weight 2.
Yeah, but the circuit you showed for flag is the one that handles weight 1 error. Not this one, the one before. I don't know, are you studying only the circuits that handle weight 1 error, or are you also considering syndrome circuits that handle weight 2?
Well, I suppose I should say this is technically not core to the research itself. I just think that these are really important things that feed into sort of really making sure that some circuit is fault tolerant, and kind of that I suppose these are things that I think actually are good to stress for the group in general, if you're interested in like sort of like the circuit level noise, that these are big problems.
But yeah, I mean, it's not. For the Steam code, I can only correct 1 error anyway. So flags for 1 error.
Yes,
would be the
in
thing
code
to
of
think
7
about.
qubit.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's.
So in this specific context, they don't. Yeah.
But I think this context still applies broadly, because it means that when different error, like the way that the character of these errors is what I call it, changes how fault tolerant something is. And so it can mean the distance is actually half as effective in reality, I think, in a lot of cases.
I have a question. It's a basic one. So why do you start considering correlated errors? Is that because you think like your C0 gate, it's on 2 qubits, so it can do some sort of correlated 2 qubit error?
Yeah.
All the other stuff are 1 qubit gate, so they don't input the correlated.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So the usual thing that people used to do is say, if I've just done a 1 qubit gate, well, it depends a little bit on whether you think the error is before or after the gate, but let's say the error sits after the gate, then the traditional thing was you pick a random Pauli for single qubit errors, and you pick a random 2 qubit Pauli for 2 qubit errors, right? And certainly if you look at any way of implementing a 2 qubit gate, it will generate some kind of 2 qubit error. But the usual, in order to check whether it's fault tolerant, you would basically want every possible 2 qubit error that occurs at that 2 qubit gate to then result in at most a correctable number of errors on the output code block. So in this case, a single 2 qubit error associated with a 2 qubit gate creates a pair of errors on the output code block that's not fault tolerant. And so, the original Steen Shor fault tolerant methods had more ancilla qubits in order to make it so that those quote unquote hook errors didn't result in pairs of errors in the output code block. And then people are now trying to come along and say, well, Steen and Shor put too many ancilla qubits there and I don't want to implement them. So I want to do some kind of shortcut. And that's where these flag kind of things come.
So if you go back, so here you have 3 ancillas. So
Yeah,
yes.
so this is a part of a circuit as well, I should say. There's more C0s back here, but this measures 3 stabilizers simultaneously, 1 Z1 and 2 X's. And this is a very kind of special kind of scheme where there's actually no extra flag qubits, but it flags because of this extra C0 that's been introduced between the ancillas. Basically, the X ancilla flags the Z ancilla and vice versa.
So how many ancillars? would you
So
do
back
there?
in the old days, if I had a 7-qubit code, I would have a 7-qubit ancilla. And there's and that way I can do the stabilizer readout without ever. So you notice here, some of these ancillas are coupled to the code block more than once. And I can avoid these hook errors if every ancilla, it couples only to one qubit in the code block at one time step. So then a single 2-qubit error would cause a poorly on the code block and one on the ancilla, but the ancilla one would get, so that's tolerable, so that would then, I leave behind at most a single error on the
Like effectively, you
on
do
the
like a
code block.
transversal gate to the end.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually a more efficient way of saying it. By coupling to the ancilla through a transversal gate at all times, I'm winning.
Yeah, but all of this matters because what we're doing is going to be circuit level, right? And we assume that sort of it's a fault out on the C0, right? And what we're really looking, so what in total, what we're looking at, right? We're trying to do sort of like fault-tolerant tomography of this logical T-gate as if it was being done like at the experimental level. You've got gates, you're applying it, the whole shebang, right? You're preparing some states, you're doing your magic state injection, and then you're doing your error correction and sort of final measurement at the end. And each C0 is faulty, right? Just the C0s, I'll stress this, with a 2-qubit biased noise model. And as far as the simulation went, we kind of just simulated every single term up to as it says there, with a rate that's rate greater than p to the 4, right? And at that point, everything kind of like ends up sort of saturating anyway, because because of the fact that the distance is so small, sort of like the lowest order terms kind of just become prominent straight away. And then these other terms kind of become less relevant. Yeah, and because it's also because of the fact that we're talking about weight 2 errors, right? We're also talking about errors like weights of errors, which are much larger, like up to double the actual failure rate as well.
So when you say simulate, are you going to tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, so simulate, place Pauli's, look at assume so many C0s fail, place a relevant Pauli at that location. And then I commuted these Paulis to the end of the circuit and calculated the action on the ideal state, and then use that to figure out the final error.
Is that a Clifford? So for each, the gate you're simulating is a Clifford. So this is a Clifford simulation. This is a stabilizer simulation, or
For most of the circuits, a stabilizer simulation, but in the magic state preparation, there's a whole bunch
Right,
of T-gates,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that makes this complicated
right,
broadly.
right. So that's why you're truncating the expansion, because
Yes.
the T-gate part of your simulation is actually like a very large sum of possible errors.
Yeah, and there's already a lot of errors in this. Obviously, this is all logical, right? So there's like lots of C0s that get built into every single one of these parts, right? So there's lots of errors already, and then with the T-gates, this just makes it really painful.
This circuit, how many qubits would you need to deal with? Is that 14?
14 simultaneous, like really, because there's also ancillas as well, so it's really more like 26, I think, something like that. It depends on how you're cutting. I've never dealt with all the qubits simultaneously while doing the simulation, but because there will be for like each error detection or error correction, there's 6 ancillas, and then in these checks there's also ancillas as well. So okay, so just to kind of harken back a bit, right? What are we doing? We're like looking at a whole bunch of different biased noise models. Each C0 has some kind of biased noise. want to look at how sort of like various rates of error, various types of bias affect the logical noise, the logical bias in this kind of fault-tolerant gate. And I often kind of make the mistake of assuming that plots are just self-evident. But so I'll actually explain what's going on here. On the x-axis is the failure rate P, right? And then on the y-axis, what we're looking at is the logical infidelity of the noise. And here, all of these different lines are just different levels of Z bias. And so there doesn't, so the first thing that's immediately, I guess, obvious is that doesn't seem to be much dependence on Z bias here. And in some sense, this is kind of like a sanity check because the Steam code isn't really designed for bias noise, right? So we shouldn't actually expect any level of bias to really have a notable impact on the logical performance, right? The infidelity of the Steam code. And then looking at sort of the trend, right? This is a quadratic trend, which matches up basically with what you'd expect from the distance, right? So,
Sorry, can I just verify, just double check, I think you explained it, but like the thing you're doing is you're preparing a magic state and then doing a C0 gate and then asking how often that works. Is that the circuit that you're running?
Well, yeah. So preparing, so this is a logical tomography experiment. So these Cliffords are like a transversal Cliffords that are being applied to prepare different initial states and final measurements. But preparing sort of fault tolerantly some initial stabilizer state, some initial magic state, doing sort of a logical magic state injection, and then doing final error correction and measurement to get sort of like the logical outcome at the end.
And in your y-axis, sorry, your x-axis, you had C0 failure, right? So by C0, you mean that C0 in the middle? That
all C0s involved in this.
okay,
Every single C0.
right. So there's C0s going on in.
There's
Right,
C0s
okay.
everywhere, basically.
You're applying errors to every C0 gate, and then okay.
Yeah, every check, every error detection round, like this transversal C0 here, very dense in C0s in actuality.
Yeah, and I missed the key fact that you're doing this logical tomography. So you're basically, this magic state injection is supposed to implement a T-gate. You're putting Clifford gates before and after the T injection in order to check what is the actual noisy map that you've performed, and then you're reporting the fidelity of that map based on that tomography. Are you putting errors in those Cliffords so that or are you putting no error? I mean, I could imagine
Cliffords here.
Yeah, I could imagine an argument where you say, "Oh, I want to understand what's the noise in T state injection, so I'm going to implement the Cliffords without noise." Or I could imagine an argument where you say, "I'm simulating a gate tomography experiment, so I'm going to put noise on the Cliffords."
Well, see, these Cliffords here are single qubit.
Oh,
So
they have no noise.
they have no noise. But this error correction circuit here is many C0s. So there is still noise going on here as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And
so when you say ED, I just realized that I looked at that and I didn't understand it the first time. So EC is for error correction. ED is for what?
Error detection.
Oh, so why is there an error detection? So you're going to detect errors and throw away failed state preparation. Is that right?
Yes.
So that's in the magic state part of the world. I understand why that's there. So that's the way magic state distillation works. I detect errors and throw away failures. For the initial state, you just wanted to do something equivalent. Like, what's the motivation for doing error detection on the initial state?
Yeah, so it's less. So you're exactly right.
I mean, why don't I put in just actually a perfect logical state into the gate?
So I guess there's two motivations here. One is that I kind of want to, well, I guess I'll first comment by saying you're exactly right that the magic state preparation, it's necessitated that you have this error detection circuit. You can't do it without that. And also that this error detection up here is maybe less necessary for a lot of reasons. But the reason why I've included this is because in the current way that this this stabilizer state is prepared, you do get X and Z errors from like a single fault, like wait 2 errors at the end, X and Z, with just a single fault. And so these are actually, well, as kind of suggested before, these are actually bad.
Yeah.
And so in some sense, I'm treating these equally because I want to get rid of those errors as
Yeah.
well. And especially when you have these sort of like Clifford gates, which are taking you into other states, like you can be a bit more meticulous and fine-grained here and trial because of the fact that you're preparing this state and it's at the beginning, you can be a little bit
Yeah.
particular about this and potentially deal with it, but it's actually rather tricky. It's more tricky than it
means-
might seem.
So it means that you're considering states like
Only
it-
have a single error. Like,
they only have a single error, but I think if you there's some argument that if you only put in states with no errors, then you would be a little bit cheating because the fault tolerant gate should actually work if you're putting if you put single errors in at the input, you should have no more than that shouldn't propagate to a, it should be no worse than that at the output.
yeah, but what this ensures is that every single prepared logical state has no more than a single
Yeah.
error, right? And it still has single errors at first order in the error rate, but it's just a single error.
Yeah.
It's what that ensures. And I should also say the error detection circuit actually here is actually sort of a new error detection scheme that I developed for the paper, but it's, appendix relegated. So. Yeah, so this is kind of like, as you'd expect, distance is 3, so you get this quadratic scaling. Bias is not that, doesn't affect it because this is a Steam code, right? It's not like an XZZX code.
Is
but-
it, so what you're seeing there is that the error is proportional to p squared with some moderately large coefficient.
Yeah.
And that coefficient should be roughly the number of possible error pairs. Is there some way of understanding that coefficient, or is it just that I did the simulation and that's what it came out to be?
It's hard. It's especially hard with so much, especially because of this. Like I think with like a larger code where, like the terms which contribute due to like the stabilizer checks are a bit like more localized.
Yeah.
With respect to like because the distance is so small, like every term here is like basically the size of the distance anyway, that all of these contribute in like a analogous way. And so it's hard to like say, like, because you could say, oh, it's mainly because of like the number of combinations on like the transversal C0 or something like that. But you can't really boil it down as neatly because of like how large the contribution is from each of these terms, basically. Yeah. And yeah, it is quite large, as you can see as well. There's like quite a lot of, like, if you assume that like AP squared is just like a single
That's
2-fault term,
it's nearly
there's
100.
like 100 or something here. So, but if you look at what's going on at the sort of logical bias level, right? So, taking sort of your, you've got some kind of, from your logical tomography, you've got some logical process at the end. You can look at the failure rates of each sort of Pali term and then sort of derive some kind of logical bias. What you see is actually much like, unlike the previous case, it's a much stronger sort of connection between the physical bias and the logical bias here. And you can see that this doesn't change much with the failure rate, and that's because essentially because the distance of the Steam code is so low, such that the weight 2 terms kind of contribute to the majority of the noise in these kinds of simulations that we see.
So hang on, this thing is telling me that if I have a particular bias at the physical error on the C0s, the Z bias of the logical noise is like amplified, it's bigger.
Yes, yes. And this is something you'll generally see. From now on, we'll probably focus more on the bias to bias relationship because of the fact that kind of the small distance and the structure of the Steam code means that sort of looking at infidelities and failure rates is not as big here, but that's exactly what we'll be looking at more.
So just to be clear, if I look at the fidelity, I don't see any effect. So the fidelity is much the same,
Yeah.
but whatever bias I had is exaggerated.
Yes. And this is very much related to sort of like, okay, maybe I might start saying stuff that gets out of the scope of the paper and gets a bit speculative, but it very much relates to like the distances associated with various logical terms. But I think it'll probably become clearer as I go on. So let's just focus on this like physical bias to logical bias, right? As we can see that there's some kind of relationship here. Let's actually put this as like against each other. On the x-axis, we have various kinds of physical bias, and on the y-axis, we're looking at the logical z bias. And just to note here, this line. So these arrows here, first of all, are the bias for depolarizing noise, so physical depolarizing, and this is the logical depolarizing rate. Logical depolarizing bias. And so kind of just, this is the same, in blue is basically what you're seeing here. Your physical bias to your logical bias sort of increases at this sort of quadratic rate. Like it quadratically amplifies. And essentially the reason for this is because of the distance of the code, right? If you assume that Z physical noise is occurring at some biased rate, let's say we're thinking about the most likely terms are going to be these two fault terms, right? Then the most likely two fault term is going to be when you have two Z errors occur, right? And then for the distance of the Steam code, if it's two fault errors, then these will be corrected into a logical Z failure, right? And so you see this quadratic scaling from your physical bias to your logical bias. And so it's very much related to the distance in that way.
Yeah, so you're saying if a single Z error is slightly more likely than a Y or an X, then a pair of Z errors is a lot more likely than a pair of Ys or a pair of X's.
Yeah.
Or even than an X with a, yeah. Okay.
And essentially that's what causes this kind of scaling. Oh yeah, I forgot.
And so if that logic is correct, then if I put a X bias into my noise and I do the Steam code, the same thing should happen. X logical bias should end up preferred.
Yeah, exactly. But actually, and you're touching
if I put
on
a Y bias in, something else would occur.
Yeah, it should be a logical Y bias. Yeah.
Oh, I'm not sure about that.
Well, if you assume that
X and Z are special for the Steam code because it's CSS, right?
Yeah, well, I guess the I don't want to like split the. I guess we should split the hair actually. If you're assuming that there is like physical Y bias, right, then you're introducing sort of lots of Y errors, right? And then if Y errors are close to like the syndrome that you would get for that would bring you still to a logical Y error at the end. Assuming there's like some other subtleties in it. So it's hard to talk about completely, but you should get logical Y error as well in that case.
Yeah, okay.
But there's actually other forces at play, I suppose, here. Because so what you can see for like this physical X and physical Y bias, right, is a kind of like plateaus here. Obviously this is Z biased logical noise, but it plateauing here seems to suggest that it's like logical depolarizing noise, right? So that doesn't quite line up with what you'd expect normally.
But I think if you plotted on the Y-axis X logical bias, then
Again,
the X
X.
line would have to do what the blues are doing.
Yeah,
And
but
the blues would have to lie along the.
But you don't get that.
Why
So
not?
here on the x-axis we have X physical bias and then Y logical bias, and then comparing obviously with the previous Z versus Z, where it's quadratic, this actually plateaus. And not only does it plateau, it actually doesn't even become X bias because it
So
plateaus
what breaks
below.
the symmetry of the code?
Yeah, and so the reason why this happens is because essentially sort of like in essence, it comes down to this effect, which is actually a gadget effect really of the magic state injection, which is that if you have Z noise on your logical magic state, this spreads to a Z error of the same syndrome on the logical qubit that you're acting on. But if you have X errors, what ends up happening is that these don't even spread, right? They cause a measurement failure. And this measurement failure causes a misapplication of your logical phase gate as well, which has sort of Z character in terms of bias. And so actually any sort of kind of errors that you have on your logical magic state essentially get transformed into logical phase noise, right? And so this ends up actually having a secondary effect which transforms the type of noise, in addition to this sort of bias amplification. And so that's what causes this plateau, because there's while in the Z case, right, you can kind of like freely sort of have this amplification happen, while these logical X terms are more likely, also there's a whole bunch of logical X terms that are being transformed into Z type terms, right? And so then that balances out at the logical level. And I guess I've added a whole bunch of, actually now I've added a whole bunch of slides, and I realize I probably don't have the time to talk about all of them. But this is actually quite different to what happens when a Clifford acts, because when a Clifford acts normally, you will get some kind of different level of bias at the end, right? The Y bias before this Clifford will be different to the Y bias after this Clifford, right? Because the Y1 will become Y1X2 and so on. These will all map, right? But you could, hypothetically, you could define a new form of bias such that the overall extent of bias is the same, right? You just choose the set of the new errors, what they get mapped to, and the extent of bias would still be the same for this new set of errors. But that's not what's happening here, because some errors are actually being transformed into a different type of error in like a non sort of Clifford transformative way. So the actual extent of bias is fundamentally changing by this injection process. And I think that's pretty key. But I guess I probably can make it in time. We've looked at ZX and Y bias sort of in like a more sort of standard way, right? Suppose we're in this kind of multi-qubit regime looking at some more interesting types of bias like this mixed bias. And this mixed bias is actually quite unique as far as CNOTs are concerned, because it's the only sort of way you can define high rate bias such that none of the high rate errors actually change. They commute with the CNOT itself. And this is rather well motivated in terms of the kind of bias that you might see in terms of in experiment, like Z-biased CZs, or in Molnar-Sorensen gates XX, X-biased noise. In fact, Shruti kind of didn't explicitly talk about this bias, but at QEC mentioned how this kind of, if you're assuming Z bias and you're doing CNOTs, you're going to get something which is like ZX. And so it's kind of at the core of, I suppose, of a lot of biased noise. And the interesting thing that happens is, if you think about this kind of ZX bias, is that if you look at just the injection component alone, right, this ZX bias actually can have this sort of quadratic scaling where you have really high logical Z bias. And the reason why is because the high Z bias, like the on the control qubit, the Z noise that is being introduced is highly Z biased, right? Whereas all the high rate X errors are being introduced to the magic state, logical magic state, which is then being transformed into Z noise. And so despite having sort of like a mixed noise character in actuality, due to the structure of the circuit, you actually get really highly Z biased noise, as if it was all completely logically Z biased, all all physically Z biased, right, in the same way. But this breaks down when you really consider error correction, because unlike the transversal
Oh,
gate,
sorry, that's what the blue diamond and the red square is. The red square corresponds to mixed bias.
yes,
And the Z's, the blues are what plots we've seen before that are Z biased.
yeah.
Yeah.
But this time also restricted to these components, so it's technically
Oh,
different.
you're
but-
only putting mixed bias where there's pink in the circuit.
Yes, just the magic state injection component. And you still get this, like, despite the fact that we're introducing mixed noise, right? So Z and X noise is at high rate, right? Because of the way that the gate's being performed, X noise is only being introduced at high rate to the magic state, logical magic state, and this is then getting transformed. But this fundamentally breaks down when you consider error correction, because error correction doesn't respect the character of noise in the same way. If you have mixed noise in your error correction, this will get introduced to your logical circuit as mixed noise, at least in terms of how error correction is currently being performed.
Yeah, this particular type of error correction.
Yeah. And so because of that, you have this mixed noise being introduced at high rate, which essentially plateaus the logical bias. And it's still, well, at least compared to the, yeah, it's still quite high, right? But it does plateau because of this introduction of mixed noise. And so I think the key thing from this work is that it really, if you're really concerned about bias, it really important thing to consider is how your error correction is playing with bias, because the character of noise within error correction is going to have a big influence on the character of noise on your logical qubit that you're implementing.
The answer to this, you didn't try multiple rounds of error correction to see what that did.
No. And essentially because this error correction is, in some sense, this error correction here is technically part of the logical tomography. But in this, I think regardless of that fact, the structure of error correction is fundamentally different from the structure of a transversal gate. And I think that's pretty core to why this effect occurs. Because essentially, like, you're having CNOTs applied in sort of different ways, and it's not really transversal, right? That's the whole reason why we have like we're trying to do these things with like hook errors and stuff like that, because of the fact that in some sense, you need to make sure you have different fault-tolerant considerations for your error correction. But yeah, sorry, I realize we hit the hour, but we are at the end. I guess quick summary, right? Bias amplification happens. Noise transformation really matters in these magic state injection circuit, but error correction is really going to be that important thing about if you care about logical bias. But I suppose the question is, why would you care about logical bias? Right. Well, first of all, you can potentially use this in conjunction with things like concatenation, like concatenating codes, and then use a code which is considerate of the logical bias on the lower code. But especially in this case, where we're talking about magic state injection, we're talking about T-gates. If we're talking about concatenating codes, that kind of implies something about magic state distillation. And so at least within the context of this work, the key thing is that the reason why you'd care about sort of like high Z bias or some high of some kind of bias is that distillation schemes fare a lot worse against like X and Y type noise that are introduced to your logical qubits. And so because they don't commute with your phase gates. And so ensuring a high bias is really important for the performance of those schemes. Any questions, or should we just call it since we're... You can ask me questions at lunch.
Thanks.